right now, the Middle East might quietly be redesigning the global oil map. Not with missiles, not with speeches, but with pipelines. Because after months of war, shipping disruptions, attacks on infrastructure, and growing fears around the Strait of Hormuz, the United Arab Emirates just made a major move. A move that could permanently change how Gulf oil reaches the global markets. The UAE is now accelerating a massive pipeline project designed to bypass the Strait of Hormuz altogether. And this is bigger than just energy because for decades the Strait of Hormuz was one of the world's greatest pressure points and to some extent is still a narrow strip of water through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil passed through. But after the US, Iran, and Israel conflict, everything changed. The Gulf states saw and witnessed how quickly one choke point could shake the entire global economy. And now they are preparing for a future where they may never want to depend on it the same way again. So, in this episode, we break down why the UAE is rushing this project, what Iran's actions changed, why the city of Fujairah suddenly matters more than ever, and whether the Strait of Hormuz is slowly losing its monopoly over the Gulf market. Welcome back to another episode of Bridging Perspectives with Danya Rana, where we connect geopolitics to real events shaping everyday life. For years, the Strait of Hormuz was seen as one of the world's most important waterways and one of its most dangerous because if you look at the map, it almost looks too small to even matter. But this narrow passage between Iran and the Gulf states became the artery of the global energy system. Oil tankers from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain all moved through this single narrow passage before heading towards Asia, Europe, and beyond. And so, when the US-Iran conflict began, the disruption in this small, narrow waterway affected fuel prices, inflation, shipping costs, airline tickets, and most importantly, entire economies in the world, which includes people like you and me. And for decades, everyone understood the same thing. If the Hormuz closes, the world feels it. And that is where the Iran war changed everything. And that is where the recent Iran war changed the psychology of Gulf. Not just politically, strategically. Because suddenly, the threat was no longer just theoretical. The conflict created serious fears around energy. There were attacks on infrastructure, shipping got disrupted, rising insurance costs for tankers and airplanes, and growing uncertainty of trade in the most important area for the Gulf. And then came Iran's new maritime protocols for the Strait of Hormuz. And although oil did not stop completely, the message became very clear. The Gulf states could no longer assume uninterrupted access forever. And that changed how governments thought, especially those governments whose economy largely depends on energy exports. Because modern states don't only plan for peace, they plan for worst case scenarios. And that is where UAE's latest decision becomes so important. This week, the UAE officially announced it is accelerating the expansion of the West East oil pipeline. The announcement came during an executive meeting held by Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed and ADNOC leadership. According to official statements, the project is being fast-tracked to help meet global demands and improve export flexibility. The pipeline is expected to become operational by 2027. Now, here's why this matters. The UAE already has a very important pipeline called ADCOP, also known as Abu Dhabi Crude Oil Pipeline, the Habshan Fujairah pipeline. The pipeline started operating in 2012 and it already allows UAE to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, but partially, by transporting oil directly from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coast. In simpler terms, this means that oil does not need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz before it enters open waters. Strategically, that is huge because Fujairah sits outside the Strait of Hormuz. And in times of uncertainty, that location becomes priceless. The current pipeline carries around 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. But the new expansion project is expected to carry double. That means the UAE is not just simply reacting to this temporarily, it is redesigning long-term energy security. And so we've been hearing about Fujairah and what it is, why Fujairah actually matters so much. Most people outside the region never even thought about Fujairah before. But in energy geopolitics, Fujairah is becoming one of the Gulf's most strategic cities. Why? Because at the end of the day, geography does matter. And sometimes it becomes power. Fujairah gives UAE direct access to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea without entirely depending on the Strait of Hormuz. In simpler terms, if Hormuz becomes unstable, Fujairah becomes the backdoor. And after the recent war, we can clearly tell that backdoors are very important. But here's the interesting part. Even Fujairah was subjected to attacks during the recent conflict. So this is not about creating a perfect solution. It's about reducing vulnerability. And that is an important difference. No country can remove risks completely. Countries can reduce their dependency on one single point of failure. That is exactly what's happening. And so that brings us to our next point. This is where the story becomes bigger than just pipelines. Because infrastructure decisions tell us how governments see the future. When countries spend billions building alternative routes, they are telling you something. They are preparing for a world where instability may become normal, where economic survival requires redundancy, where trade routes become national security assets, and where energy exports are no longer just business, but geopolitical resistance. For the UAE specifically, this also strengthens its image as a reliable global energy supplier. And that matters enormously because during periods of global uncertainty and instability, countries that maintain stable exports gain trust of others. And that trust becomes strategic power, especially in energy markets. And so, with all of this said, one question arises. Does this mean that the Strait of Hormuz is losing its power? Absolutely not. Hormuz still remains one of the world's most critical energy corridors. Millions of barrels still move through it every day. But something very important has started to change. For decades, Hormuz held almost monopoly level strategic pressure. Now, Gulf countries are slowly building alternatives to that, slowly reducing dependency, creating flexibility. And not today, but over time, this will change the balance of power. Because choke points like these are strongest when there are no alternatives. The moment alternatives begin growing, the leverage starts changing too. All of this may sound like distant geopolitics to you, but eventually it does reach people worldwide. A blocked shipping lane somewhere in the Gulf can affect grocery prices thousands of kilometers away. And that is the reality of globalization. In many ways, the UAE is still seen as a country still exporting energy to the world. But it is now thinking differently about vulnerability and thinking differently about security. Modern power is no longer just about controlling your resources. It's about protecting roots, creating resilience, and most of all, ensuring continuity even during instability. And so, with that, we come to an end of today's episode. I hope this episode gave you insightful information on UAE accelerating its oil pipeline project, how that affects geopolitics and countries, especially people living in other corners of the world. Stay tuned for another exciting episode and don't forget to hit that subscribe button below. See you guys in another episode.